This video is purely educational. It does not promote or depict real money play. No real hands are shown.
In modern poker, bluffing is more nuanced than ever. Poker is a game of skill, and the best professional players in the world have a number of techniques to make the things they want to happen, happen. Specifically for bluffing, the best professional players in the world know exactly how to make their opponents fold more often. If this sounds like wizardry, wait a second because this gets even more interesting. Consider the following two boards. These are played in a single raise pot in that very classic button versus big blind formation. Both are triple barrel spots, meaning that button bluffed on the flop, bluffed on the turn, and now bluffed on the river. There are just two things that differ between these two scenarios. The first one is the bet size that was used earlier in the hand. In this high board example, button used a smaller bet on the turn, as is approved in theory, versus in this example, the texture is different, which also caused button to use a larger bet on the turn. Now, to the untrained eye, it is very difficult to figure out where bluffing is good and where bluffing is bad. But to the professional poker player, they know for a fact on which board their opponent is more likely to fold. It's not magic, it's all theory. In this video, we'll uncover it and teach some amazing lessons that explain exactly why pros bluff better. Let's jump right into it. Before we cover a few common bluffing mistakes that less advanced poker players make, I want to reveal the big bluffing secret that professional players don't want anyone else to know. We're going to demystify what they do. And that secret is that bluffing in almost all lines is effective as long as you know where it's done. A big focus of my channel is to compare different lines for bluffing, and that's actually one of the things that we'll do in this video. A line is defined as just what actions were taken in the hand. So for instance, if button bet for 3 streets, that is called the bet line, versus if button checked on the turn after betting on the flop, and then if they bet again on the river, bet check bet, right? So while certain lines will naturally be more favorable for bluffing than others, according to tons of research, tons of data, and a lot of theory as well, the real big key secret is that bluffing in every single line, or almost every single line, is going to be effective. You just have to know exactly what to look for. And I'm not simply talking about player type. I mean, it's really obvious that if a player folds a lot, then bluffing against them is generally going to be very favorable. No, I'm talking specifically about textual considerations and size considerations, which are invisible to the untrained eye. Luckily for you, I'm going to train your eye just like the pros. And believe me, it's actually a lot simpler than it seems. Let's actually go back to those two examples and break everything down from the top before we talk a bit more about the specific methodology. Bluffing on one of these two boards is going to be far superior than the other. And believe it or not, it's actually this ace, king, queen, 10 board that takes the cake. I'm willing to say that maybe 40% of my viewers got this one right, but the reason why actually matters a lot. This board is much more connected than the other one, and that is only part of the correct answer. Usually bluffing on more connected boards is going to be worse, but this specific board has something going for it. That is the fact that through this bet sequence of betting big on the flop and then betting small on the turn, and also just because of some pre-flop theory, big blind's range is very condensed towards ace-x top pairs. In fact, if we go right over here into one of my flagship courses at Savant, you will see what big blind's defending range looks like on the river. This is a 4 straight and 3 flush board, and of course, big blind has a lot of straights and flushes here. But in order to meet their minimum defense frequency, they actually have to call with around 25% of their top pairs and some other weak hands. That's a very big number considering that this ace-x offsuit region is a pretty substantial portion of big blind's range. Pros just know that most players as big blind are going to see this board, they're going to think that it looks really scary, it looks very connected, they might think it's difficult for button to find bluffs here. Whatever the reasons are, the data overwhelmingly shows that in spots like this one, most players will fold tremendously often as big blind. Pros know this, and they will capitalize on it when they are playing as button. Now, the other board certainly looks good, but if we look at the solution, bluffing is just not going to be as favorable as it is on the previous one. Button did use a larger bet on the turn, which definitely condenses big blind's range, but this is just a much drier board where most of big blind's range is going to be condensed towards second pairs. The big difference, in my opinion, is that second pairs don't look as weak as top pairs do on the previous board. If someone is playing as big blind and they know that button is a bit more of an aggressive, bluffy, professional poker player, they're not going to be afraid to call second pairs here. Second pairs are just very clear, natural bluff catchers. Most players know that they'll be strong enough to call, and they'll definitely just call if they suspect that button bluffs a lot. Versus on the previous one, opponents are probably just going to be way too scared to call. They might not even realize that top pairs are able to call. I am just hypothesizing what the reasons are here. At the end of the day though, the data overwhelmingly shows that people are much more likely to call on boards like this one. That's the true power of theory, because if you're just looking at these two boards without paying much attention to the solver strategy, it's pretty much impossible to know where bluffing is going to be better. I've spent thousands of hours in my professional playing and coaching career breaking down solver outputs to reveal insights like this one. And along the way, I've actually noticed that a lot of these insights start to form patterns when you see them often enough. I've spent a lot of time studying data, and one of my key interests was why are opponents more likely to fold in certain situations. And so I'm going to reveal two big secrets that I found through my analysis. This really boils down so much of my research into just a few sentences, so if you like this, please do subscribe. It helps my channel out a lot. Oh, and before I forget, if you guys are interested in poker's mental game, I spent a few months researching it from a psychological perspective and created a 60-page ebook that has so much practical insights into it. If you're interested, give it a look. Amazing, amazing content. Without further ado, let's just get back into the secret of bluffing. I mentioned that there were two big insights that I found. The first one, and this is so absolutely huge, is that there is a massive correlation between spots that are overfolded according to mass data and spots where players have a low defending threshold. If we go back to that ace, king, queen, 10 example, we know now that big blind has a very low defending threshold because top pairs look and feel very weak on this really connected 3-flush board. However, in the other example, big blind has a much higher defending threshold because second pairs generally feel much stronger on this board. They're easier to find as defense. We'll go over a few more examples in just a quick second, but I want to point out that the defending threshold is going to be influenced by things like bet size, texture, position, and honestly, even player type. We'll go over a few spots later to really get this down. Because this is so important, I want you guys to always remember, pros bluff better because they understand the threshold. That is why understanding poker theory is so important. The second key takeaway is that there is a data correlation between spots where opponents are more likely to fold and spots where the active player looks stronger. Again, the ace, king, queen, 10 is a fantastic example because it really does look like button might have a stronger range here, at least compared to the other spot. Here, it's super easy to imagine just all of the weak hands in button's range because the board is so dry, it's so disconnected, versus this spot is more of like a what bluffs could he possibly even have type of spot. This is just the bet line, but this becomes much more apparent when we start to look at lines that have raises in them. So for example, people might have a very high defending threshold in like a 3-bet pot, but then when they're faced with a turn raise or a turn check raise, they will massively overfold their range because it's really difficult for them to imagine people bluff raising often enough in that turn raise or check raise line. Bigger bets are also another fantastic example of this. As we'll see later, people usually fold more versus very big bets. There is a bit of nuance to this, but big bets just look very strong. Data shows that people fold more often, even though they'll have a much higher defending threshold against bigger bets. This one's actually really cool and it goes into some bet sizing theory. So smaller bets will also outperform medium-sized bets because according to that first key point, the defending threshold is going to be much lower against smaller bets. We see this play out in the data pretty much in every single river, every single turn spot, every single flop spot. This is really cool. Makes a lot of intuitive sense when you look at it from this perspective. And to really help you intuitively understand this concept, I have two more example boards that teach both of them perfectly. Both of them will still be in single raised pots, played as button versus big blind, because that's what my flagship course focuses on. And again, you can study these spots and so many others with in-depth annotations up on the website. So the first one is a button versus big blind monotone flop. This is queen 10-9, and the data does overwhelmingly show that if button bets small, most players will fold far too often as big blind. And the reason is again twofold. So that very first concept states that people fold more when the defending threshold is low, and that is absolutely the case right over here. Looking at the solution, you can see that big blind has to call with a ton of the weaker 9x, and hands like 9-6 just really feel and look very weak here. People might not necessarily know that they're not allowed to fold their third pairs that often, even though it's a monotone flop that's really high and really connected. And of course, the second point also naturally ties into this. I think players are much more likely to fold their 9x here because it looks like button will be betting with a stronger range. The high board naturally favors button. It's difficult to imagine button holding a lot of bluffs like 6-4 of clubs, and possibly players expect button to barrel a bit too often on the turn or just generally underbluff this spot. Both of the key insights definitely apply here. Let's look at one more board. Now this might look a little bit similar to that paired board that we discussed earlier, but the biggest difference is that this is a bet check bet line. Right, I talked about different lines being better or worse for bluffing. This one happens to be better. Now that turn check is really important strategically. Two things happen. First of all, big blind has a wider range because usually bets condense the range versus checks keep it wide. And second of all, to get to bet check bet, button has to check themselves on the river. They'll usually bet a lot of their strong hands, check a lot of their medium strength and weak hands, and therefore they're just left with a much lower defending threshold. I talk a lot about this in the article titled Bluffing in Bet Check Bet, and right over here you can see just how low big blind's defending threshold is on a board that's slightly similar to the one we just reviewed. If you remember that paired dry board, we acknowledged that big blind's defending threshold was second pair, but here it is actually fifth pair. I mean, they have to call with pocket 4s, pocket 3s. They pretty much aren't able to fold their 6x. And if we switch over to the board we just saw, we can see that the situation is pretty much the same. Big blind has to call 50% of the time with their 3-2, their 4-3, their 5-3. Their 6x isn't able to fold. It's just such a low defending threshold compared to the second pair that we saw near the start of the video. Now, less advanced poker players might look at this spot and reason that they should check because they're holding ace-5 that has a lot of showdown value. But again, the true power of solver analysis is that it tells us when our baseline assumptions are incorrect. According to sheer math and sheer theory, ace-5 and ace-4 are definitely not too strong to bluff here. They're betting a little bit according to the equilibrium, and of course they make for such better bluffs when big blind is more likely to fold because they have such a low defending threshold that is easy to miss. The weaker player will check ace-5 here and lose against a hand like 6-5 or 3-2, but the professional poker player will pick up on big blind's low defending threshold, they will bluff, and they will get a big overfold. Such a cool spot, definitely a bit more nuanced here, but I think this elucidates and highlights the concepts quite clearly. Let's really talk a bit more about this bet check bet versus bet 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 stuff, because it's a pretty big focus in the free portion of that flagship course. The data does show that bet check bet will generally be much better than bet 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 for bluffing. And that has some serious implications for professional poker players. The weaker poker player might think that bluffing or not bluffing is a decision that is made on that individual street, one step at a time. But the advanced and professional poker players will look ahead when it comes to structuring their overall bluffing strategy. It's just like chess, and it really demonstrates why poker is a game of skill, not of chance. Just like chess players who think several moves ahead, professional poker players do the exact same thing. They understand that bet check bet is better than bet 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 for bluffing, therefore they will actually structure their strategy around checking the turn more often with bluffs. But the problem is that simply knowing this information doesn't magically turn weaker players into more advanced ones. In my playing and coaching experience, I've actually found that weaker players will make a few big mistakes when they first learn this concept. All of it really boils down to building an ideal strategy for bluffing on the turn. As a crystal clear example, this is a turn spot for button versus big blind, and the question is, how often should button bet with their hand over here? Let's again compare how the weaker player versus the advanced player would approach the spot. Even if the weaker player understands that their primary goal is to check on the turn, they might simply reason that they're holding a flush draw, they still need to bluff on the turn a certain amount of the time, and therefore maybe they'll bet this hand like 50% of the time or 100% of the time, doesn't really matter. The professional player, however, knows their theory so much better that they know that the best move for them is to actually check this hand on the turn always. This really boils down to understanding theory for this turn spot. In this Free Savant Poker article, I'm comparing the solver strategy for this spot versus how a pro might approach it. And the key point is that the pro is able to recognize that this board isn't all that favorable for Button's range. Button is actually supposed to still check 70% of the time, therefore they're not allowed to bluff all that often to begin with. They have a lot more flush draws and various other hands compared to how many value hands they would like to bet. So if their goal is to minimize bluffing on the turn and maximize bluffing in bet check bet, they're able to recognize that they can bluff much less frequently on the turn than many newer players might think. They'll probably just end up checking with their queen 8, checking with most of their flush draws, and only really bluff every now and then with their best draws like 10-8 or 5-4, and this gets them to the exact frequency they want. Professional players know that if they bluff too often on the turn, they are not accomplishing their goal of checking more bluffs on the turn, but if they never bluff on the turn, then their opponent will simply catch on to what they're doing. But this is just one of the bluffing mistakes that weaker players make. The other one takes us right back to what we talked about at the start of the video, and that is not understanding which spots are favorable for bluffing. As I mentioned, one of the big secrets is that bluffing in pretty much every line is going to be good if you know what to look for, and professional players know what to look for. Let me show you what that looks like. We'll start with the bet line, because there are a few textural and size considerations which make bluffing better for professional players. Let's start with texture. So generally the best textures for bluffing in bet will be low dry boards where big blind's range misses. So those are the good textures. And if you think about it, this really does tie into our first key point of bluffing. On low and dry boards, a large chunk of big blind's range will simply miss the board, and therefore they will have a very low defending threshold. Here's a great example. This is 7-7-4 King 7. It's a very low, very dry board, and even in this bet line, big blind has to call with some pocket 3s, pocket 2s, and even some ace highs like ace 8 against the river bet. When we compare that to one of the spots at the start of the video, we know that ace highs and weak pairs are much weaker calls than something like second pair. Data shows there's a big overfold here. This is exactly why. And vice versa, bad textures for bluffing will be boards that give big blind many new strong hands. It could be a spot like this one. You could check this one out for free for yourself, but it's a spot where big blind has to fold with a lot of their trips. Clearly, that's a much higher defending threshold than ace high or weak pairs in the previous example. Good pros know how to spot these patterns like the back of their hand because they spend so much time practicing them. Another natural tie into this is the bet size that Button used on previous streets. Recall that one of the big differences between these two boards was the bet size that Button used on the turn. In this paired example, Button used a bigger bet on the turn, versus in this ace king queen 10 example, Button used a smaller bet on the turn. That smaller bet kept big blind's range wide coming into the river, which sets them up for a low defending threshold versus a river bluff. Now both of these patterns carry over to bet check bet, but bet check bet will naturally have a lower defending threshold as we saw, which is why it's so much better for bluffing. As I talked about earlier, the data also reveals that players are more likely to fold versus very big bets, because although they have a higher defending threshold, players will generally perceive those to be stronger, and therefore they will fold more often. But just like with getting the turn bluffing frequency right, pros also understand that if they overuse overbets on the river, people will stop folding against them. That's why professional players know how to use them at the right frequency. Luckily for you, you don't have to guess at these concepts. That's because the tool that I've been showcasing throughout this video is a very efficient study and practice tool called Savant. For instance, there are some annotated drills that help people learn amazing theory in the best and most practical way possible. They present simulated problems, and when you pick one of the answers, they provide you with real strategic feedback. And all of that is just in the free module of the flagship course that I've referenced in this video. If you're interested in Savant, here's what you're missing. You're missing 3 modules which explain how pros think about bluffing after checking the flop. It also explains how they approach value betting, which has some equally interesting findings as what I've discussed in this video. And also there is a whole separate module dedicated to early position differences. Button versus big blind is the most common formation, but early position spots like under the gun versus big blind can be strategically very different, and those differences are equally interesting and important. I really built Savant to be the dream education platform, and I hope that you will check it out with the link down there in the description. That link will give you free access to the first module, which allow you to learn even more concepts and really practice them for yourself. If you want to learn some advanced educational strategy in the best way possible, check it out right now.